Welcome, Vintage Gamers, to a special video. Normally, I don't do card reviews anymore for spoilers for upcoming sets. Usually, there's not that many cards that make their way into Vintage, or there's not a lot of cards that excite me, or the videos do very, very poorly. But I was asked by a couple people to do one for Brothers War, and I was surprised by the number of cards that I felt interested in talking about. So, today, what we're going to do is we're going to go through all of the cards in the Brothers War set that interest me in terms of vintage. We're also going to go through some of the nice old border reprints because those are, vintage players like their cards to look nice. I don't know how else to say that. So we're just gonna go through that and see what we can find. I know there's a couple cards that I'm gonna talk in depth about in terms of actual, where and what they could see play in, and then there are some cards that I'm just going to gloss over and just say, hey, you should know this exists. It's an option, but it's probably a role player at best. Of note, some of these cards will not be played by most people. Some of these cards will probably only be tried by me, but I think that's fine. I think it's interesting to know like the limits of the format and what you can try and attempt to do. So we're going to start out with like one of the big ones. This is Third Path Iconoclast. You will right away recognize this as a monastery mentor, young pyromancer, psi kind of style effect. The big things to note are non-creature, which is very important. That means it's going to trigger off of your Moxen, which is the biggest thing. It's going to trigger off of your Mishra's Baubles. And then the second thing is the mana cost / color identity. Blue-red is both good and bad in terms of color identity. The good thing about this card is it pitches to Force of Will. It pitches to Force of Negation. That is a very high upside. The downside is it gets killed by Pyroblast, which is a very legitimate downside in Vintage when a lot of blue decks in Vintage are going to be main board Pyroblasts. So, what do I think this card is going to do, and where do I think it will be played? The hard part is a lot of the current blue-red decks that would play this card, 5 Moxen blue-red decks, Grixis decks in particular, are playing Urza Saga, and I don't really like to play blue-red threat with Urza Saga. One of the nice parts about Young Pyromancer is that the colorless symbol allows you to play it off of off-color Moxen, and this card isn't really playable off of off-color Moxen. It's not playable off of Saga either. You need very specifically to have blue and red, which makes it really hard to see this being played as a major part in a 5 Moxen deck. The place that I do think that this should be played is a place that is not seeing. It's a deck that's not seeing a ton of play right now, but it comes up every so often, and that is in a Lurrus-based Breach deck. Now, it's before Saga, most Breach players were not on Tinker-based Breach decks. They were on Lurrus decks or different versions of Breach. And now these Lurrus decks, the biggest problem with Lurrus Breach is that you're overloading the graveyard. And actually, those decks were really, really weak against things like Leyline of the Void. And that's why Breach, I don't think, was like a super strong metagame player back then. What these decks did to combat that kind of Leyline of the Void is they would typically board into or main deck Sprite Dragon. This card is actually very similar to Sprite Dragon, whereas Sprite Dragon goes hasty and tall, this card goes wide. I actually think this card is probably better than Sprite Dragon. I really do like this style effect, and it has a lot of power in a metagame where people are playing Hollow Ones and Vengevines. People are starting to trim on Hogax. People are playing Construct tokens. So I actually think that going wide opposed to Sprite Dragon makes a lot of sense. Another thing to note is that this card is a human. Cavern Human is always an option. Whether or not it's a viable option is kind of deck and metagame dependent. So I think, and this is like, you might say, well, there are no Jeskai or there are no Breach decks that are that are playing Lurrus anymore, and that's not exactly true. Just recently, Twin had a top 8 with a Jeskai. Basically, what the deck looked like was a Jeskai, the Jeskai Lurrus deck that Nox Tom has been playing with the Wastelands. It was that deck, but it played a bunch of Breach combo in it, which I think is a totally reasonable pivot and something that has existed in the past. So I think that if there are going to be any Lurrus Breach decks, even maybe just Jeskai, this card might just be good in the Jeskai Lurrus deck. This is where this card would be played. The nice part about the Jeskai Lurrus deck, the Jeskai Lurrus deck doesn't have 5 Moxen, if I recall correctly. But what it does have is 4 Mishra's Baubles, and this triggers off of Mishra's Bauble, and I think that's really, really, really interesting. So I think that this card will be played. I don't think it'll be played a lot. The decks that it fits in are kind of narrow. Like, you can play one of these in the Tinker Breach deck. I just don't think you'll find it to be very strong. That's my part, and I think you'll find it hard to cast. But this card is interesting, and this card is definitely something that Vintage players should keep an eye on, because it's something that it hits the right notes. When you say cast a non-creature spell, that's what you want to see from your Vintage token maker, is non-creature spell. You don't want it to be, instant or sorcery, because Moxen are a really important part of these token makers. This card is probably not going to see a ton of play, but it's something that people need to know exists. A human and an artificer, both are relevant cavern types. Castable off of off-color Moxen, which helps a lot. The 3 mana cost is like not a huge deal when you're playing Mana Crypts and Soul Rings and off-color Moxen in your some kind of aggro deck, a green-white aggro deck, a mono-white aggro deck. And you're going to be able to hit both artifacts and enchantments. You're going to hit Urza Saga. And in my mind, anything that can hit an Urza Saga has you have to maybe reevaluate its power level. I could see this card being played in those decks, the mono white decks and the green white decks. Obviously, the mono white decks have been playing Lurrus. I know I typically don't want to play Lurrus in those decks because I'm looking to play Archon of Emeria, because I think Archon of Emeria is by far the best hate card. By far the best hate bear, quotation marks. Prison creature. We need to find a new word for hate bear. That's actually something I've been thinking about recently. Hate bear doesn't really describe anything but Collector Roof. I guess Lavinia, maybe. I don't know. I'm trying to think about something else with that. The second half of this card is probably not super relevant. How does Spirit of the Labyrinth read, actually? Spirit of the Labyrinth. You can see this is not a script. Each player can't draw more than 1 card each turn. Ooh, so this actually... Wow, okay. So you can actually use this ability if you have a Spirit of the Labyrinth in play on your opponent's turn, and you would draw a card and they would not. Okay, that's a nice little upside. I don't think that's a huge deal, but there are white aggro decks playing Spirit of the Labyrinth, so you can actually turn this into a positive upside. Another thing it technically does is makes your Doomsday opponent have to think about their pile a small amount more. It doesn't really stop Doomsday. It doesn't really counter Thassa's Oracle. It does technically counter Thassa's Oracle plus Demonic Consultation, so not nothing. So having a little extra, gameplay against Doomsday is never a bad thing. I don't think this card will see a ton of play, but it's an option that people should be aware of when they're building their white aggro decks. Okay, this card is probably bad. I'll put that off right away. I think this card is probably not good, but this card makes me feel things. This is the kind of card that I enjoy playing. This is exactly the kind of artificer that interests me. The key is going to be the first ability. The tap ability is gravy. Anytime you untap with a creature in Vintage is like a huge question mark / oh wow, we actually untapped with something. It's a big win. I don't think you can ever expect to untap with a creature. It's kind of one of the big reasons I don't really like playing Emery. You don't have to untap with Emery to get value, but a lot of times you do. So it's all about this first ability, which is 1 in a blue, return target artifact you control to your owner's hand. And when I see that ability, all I can think about is, how do we go infinite? What makes this go infinite? How does this win on the spot? And the Discord was talking a little bit about it. I don't think we found anything that was like super concrete. Something like Grim Monolith and what was it? Or like Mana Vault and Sapphire. Did that go in? Like it was like a little short, I think. All the things I could think about were a little bit short. But if I could make a mana rock combination that goes infinite with this, or maybe you have to cost reduce it. I'd rather you didn't have to play any of the cost reducing things because those are typically not very strong. But if you can find like a very succinct infinite mana combo, I think we found infinite cast combos, but no infinite mana combos. I can't remember. Anyways, something to think about. If you know a bunch of cool things you can do with this card, please feel free to write them in the comments. I want to know. Some other things that we talked about is, oh, you can return your Thought Monitor and replay your Thought Monitor. Pretty high value. You can return your Coveted Jewel and replay your Coveted Jewel. Not bad. Especially copying a Thought Monitor or a Coveted Jewel with them on the stack if the second ability, you know, this kind of works out. So my thought would be something like an 8-cast KCI Coveted Jewel, one of those style of decks. This card is probably not good unless there's a really broken combo that I don't know about. It's probably not good, but I think it's a card that I will definitely play on stream at some point because it really does produce the kind of game actions that I enjoy, bouncing artifacts and putting them back down. Interesting card, this one, Brother's End. I don't know any decks that want this card or can cast this card. Red is a very prohibitive mana cost in Vintage. Almost no one is playing red as their primary color. Everyone's base blue. You will find blue-red decks, and you will find, you know, like Grixis decks, but red is typically a little bit of a shaky cost. However, a very interesting split card. 3 damage to each creature and each planeswalker as well. Or all artifacts with mana value 3 or less. That's like everything. 3 or less is the magic number. Something that comes up a lot. Legacy players ask, why don't Vintage players play Meltdown? That's a very big Legacy sideboard card. And the reason is because Meltdown typically doesn't hit enough of the stuff out of Mishra's Workshop. And you really want your Artifact Hate card to hit all the shop stack cards. And this one really does. Like, the 4 mana cards in Workshop, the 4 and 5 mana cards in Workshop are, you know, Mystic Forge and Lodestone, both restricted, and Golos. Most of the, you know, the lock pieces and the, you know, Karn Silex and Nettle Cyst, and a lot of the cards in that deck are 3 or less. 3 or less is usually the magic number. So, it's an interesting card. I actually think that if you can cast this card, if you can pay the mana cost of this card, it could be something that you're interested in. I don't know who exactly can do that. Maybe like a blue-red deck, or, you know, a Grixis Tinker deck that leans heavily. Well, you don't want it to be a Tinker deck because you're hitting your own artifacts. I don't know. I don't know if anyone actually wants this card. It might see no play ever. But I think it's a really powerful split effect, and I don't know if there's anything super similar to it. That exists right now. And so I think people should know about this card in case your deck does have the ability to play it and wants to play it. Okay. This is Hurkyl. And this is my favorite card in the set. I don't know if it's the best card in the set. It probably isn't, but it is my favorite card in the set. And I actually am super excited to try it in PO specifically. So there's a lot of text on this card. Bear with me. At your end step, if you've cast a non-creature spell, we reveal the top 5, and for each card type among non-creature spells you've played, you may put a card of that type into your hand. Rest on the bottom. So, if you were to cast an artifact, an instant, and a sorcery, I guess even a planeswalker, but let's say the more likely ones, an artifact, an instant, and a sorcery in the same turn, you could draw 3 cards from your top 5 with this card. Is that likely? Probably not, but it is something to strive for. And I think almost all the time you can make this always trigger on the first turn, in PO at least. Some things that I'm thinking about, some scenarios. It's turn 2, and you go Mox cast Hurkyls. If Hurkyl just resolves and nothing happens, at the end of turn, you look at your top 5 cards and you replace your Mox. You get a new Mox. That's pretty likely, or you get a top. Artifact is a very likely card to find. And I think that's on its own not even too bad, because one of the biggest problems PO has is one, having enough artifacts to make PO lethal, and two, having enough instants and sorceries that are powerful to, if your first one gets countered, having a second one. So how about this scenario? You play your Moxen and you cast your Hurkyl. Your opponent goes, I don't want you to have an extra Moxen every turn. I force your Hurkyl. You force back. You Flusterstorm back. And your Hurkyl resolves. Now, on your first end step, you could have your top 5 cards and take a Mox and a Force, a Mox and a PO, a Mox and a Fluster. It's starting to get a little powerful, or simply your opponent Pyroblast this and you misstep it. You can now you can change your misstep into a Force at the end of turn. How about another one? Here's like the dream scenario. You play a Mox, you play your Hurkyls. Sorry, even better. You start with Gitaxian Probe, show your opponent's hand. You see that they have a Force. Okay, I play Mox Hurkyl. My opponent goes, well, I don't want you to have, possibly have a new Moxen and a new sorcery at the end step. I'm going to force it. You force back. Now you're looking at your top 5 cards, and you can have up to an instant and sorcery and a artifact all from one Hurkyl. That is a very appealing scenario in my mind for a PO deck. Now, blue is hard. Blue is annoying for sure. Sometimes it's hard to cast your Narset in your PO deck, but it's not the end of the world in your Opal deck. And I do have to do some math and see like what percentage of cards are you going, like what's the likelihood that this is always going to hit for you for a certain type of card. Let's just do a quick look at PO. If I were to grab, I guess I'll just look at this list. Artifact 16, instant is probably closer. Sorcery is the one you're not going to hit very often. Sorcery, you have some sorceries, but for the most part, instant is the one that you're going to hit the most, right? You have PO and Force, and that kind of, and Flusterstorm, and Artifact is pretty good too. I have to do some math, and I have to see what the balance looks like, but I would suspect that most of the time you're looking at instants and sorceries, and I think you're going to hit most of the time. I know Narset hits most of the time, but Narset is, any non-creature. So maybe when you narrow it down, the percentages get bad. I haven't done the math yet, but I'm super excited to try. And if it means like a little bit of tweaking in your flex slots to make it more interesting, then so be it. Oh, also to note, this card is a 2/4. That's very relevant. 2/4 is a big sizing on a 3-drop. It is not going to get killed by Lightning Bolt. It will block every Root Wallow. So I'm actually, it blocks Collector Roof, it blocks Hull Breacher and Opposition Agent, and it gets around Hull Breacher. These are all things that make me super excited for this card. And like I said, I don't know if it'll actually be good. I don't know if PO decks will play it. I think PO is definitely the place you would play this card. I'm not sure that you would play it in other decks. Maybe you could play it in some kind of other blue artifact deck. I think you want to be an artifact-based deck to play this card, because I think you want to always be able to churn your artifacts into new artifacts. But I don't know. This card is exciting. This card is super interesting. This is the card that I'm going to be trying the absolute most. This is a cool card to know about. I don't know if it'll see any play, but you should know that now there is a 2-mana split card that has counter an enchantment or artifact and exile that, or stifle. Is that a card people want to play? Is that card good? I don't know. But it exists now, and so you should know it exists in case it is something that your deck is looking for. The second ability here is counter an Oracle trigger, counter a Wasteland, counter, Stifle hits a lot of things. But the fact that it also is a counter spell for Oath of Druids, for artifacts, it's a very interesting split card. I don't think this card is playable, but I feel like you should also know that this exists. They printed a bunch of really big artifacts in this set. And this one, when you cast it or attacks, you get to destroy a non-land permanent. And there's something about a Power Stone, but who cares? Notably, if you weld this into play, you don't get the cast, but if it ever attacks, you do get the destroy permanent. Interesting. And I mean, it's all colorless mana, so you can theoretically cast it off of, I don't know, channel or workshop or anything like that. I don't think this card is going to be vintage card, but it's certainly a high power level. So it's like definitely a huge upgrade on the other card that exists around this level, which is like Meteor Golem. It's 7 mana, destroy a non-land permanent, and it's like a 3/3. This card's a lot stronger than that. Okay, here's a shops card. I don't think this card will be played, but it's worth noting it exists. This is a what's the card? It's a Shimmermere. It is a flash 3-mana artifact that gives colorless spells and artifact spells flash. It also grows like crazy if you cast spells that are more than the card's power. So if you follow this up with a sphere, it'll grow. If you follow the sphere up with a nettle cyst, it'll grow. And then you can attach the nettle cyst to your flyer and maybe attack. I don't know. This card is a card I would expect someone to try in aggro-oriented workshops. I don't know if it'll be good, is the biggest problem. But it's definitely an interesting card that has some very powerful text. Oh boy. Now this is a card I can see myself putting in a lot of decks. And the reason I say that is because I think this is a perfect Karn board card. Karn board? I like the sound of that. It is a very specific effect where you tap it and you get protection from everything until turn. And that will protect you from a lot of things. It won't protect you from everything. It won't be good against, you know, Vault Key or Oracle win the game, but things that are attacking you, you will not be able to get attacked. And the weird thing is they gave it an exile clause, right? Which is to stop it from being looped by normal things. However, an exile clause helps it get looped by Karn. Now, probably not the biggest deal in our format with, you know, Karn being restricted compared to everywhere else where Karn is a 4 of. This card will probably see a bunch of play in formats, younger formats where people are attacking and they are playing for Karn. So you can just like loop this and stay a fog for a couple turns. Yeah, you know, with that said, I'm not 100% sure that this is a card that will see a ton of vintage play in Karn boards, but it's something to think about. It's definitely a new and unique effect for the Karn board. Ooh, this card is spicy. This is a Crucible of Worlds on a 2/7 5-drop that actually can be unearthed. And this is not a card that will see a lot of play in my mind. I know like maybe some Golos players will maybe actually just try this because it's, you know, it's a huge blocker. It blocks absolutely everything. It has the biggest butt. But the place that I expect this to see the most experimental play is Zeus Bond decks, and those aren't those aren't a deck that really exists anymore. It was definitely an archetype that was pioneered by, you know, a specific pilot, Zeus. But that is a deck that intrigues people, and I think if there was if Zeus was to work on a deck that made this card work and it got results, I would certainly play it on stream. And if I played it on stream, other people would try it. And it's definitely a kind of deck that people, they like this kind of deck. And the kind of deck I'm speaking about is a graveyard, loaming, dredging, bizarre, prison deck, or fast bond combo deck. I think this card needs to be played with fast bond, and the reason is because unearth is a temporary 1-turn thing. But the cool thing is that you can now mill over a Crucible of Worlds effect and mill into a fast bond combo. That's really, really powerful. Before, I think Zeus was like, you would mill over your Crucible, and then you would rebuy your Buried Ruin to get your Crucible back from your yard. Like, it was a lot of work. Now, if you have green, which is like a very legitimate cost, green is a legitimate cost, but there are ways to mitigate this. You know, just having Fast Bond and Yavimaya definitely can help you get green. Now you actually have the ability to Life from the Loam Dredge or just activate your Bazaar and unearth a Crucible. And I think that's super powerful, because if you have Fast Bond, Crucible, and a ton of lands in your yard, one turn is going to be fine. And there's a lot of ways to go infinite with like a Glacial Chasm, Fast Spawn, Bazaar, waste your Bazaar, replay your Bazaar, dredge your whole deck. Those decks are very complicated, but they have really cool and interesting lines, and I'm excited to see if, you know, this card gets played by Zeus, and if this ever becomes a workable deck, I am super excited to play it on stream. All right, we press on. There are just so many cards that are pretty close in this set, huh? The Stone Brain. It is a 2-drop legendary artifact that has the same exile clause as the Coffin, and it's gonna let you search for, you know, a card name from your opponents everywhere and exile it. So, you know, surgical extraction type effect, but you just need to know a card name. And they will get, you know, it's got that clause that all the new ones have, where for every card you exile, if that card was in their hand, then they're going to draw a card. So it doesn't have any, you know, kind of feel bads about, you know, taking cards out of their hand. Only activation as a sorcery. Now, I don't know if this will see vintage play, but it's certainly an interesting card in a Karn board. Again, we're not a super Karn format because Karn is already restricted. But there are plenty of vintage decks that, you know, use a single card to win the game. You know, a big one obviously being Thassa's Oracle out of Doomsday. Sometimes Tinker decks. Sometimes, you know, I don't know, a Tendrils deck or something. So I think a powerful new effect. Maybe it's not like a super new effect, right? Like a Jester Cap is going to do similar. Let me see what I haven't played a Jester Cap in a while. Let me see how a Jester Cap reads. Jester Cap is 4 mana, which is a huge increase, and you get to pick any 3 cards. Yeah, I think this card is a little bit better than a Jester's Cap, and it also can be rebought with Karn. So you could, in theory, play this card or play Karn, take this card out of the Karn board, play it, exile it, and then on the next turn, rebuy this card with Karn from exile and take another set of cards. So I think this card will probably see more play in other formats than it will in vintage. The big application is mono green Pioneer, like loops Karns and things. So you can just exile every card in your opponent's deck and then make them draw out with it, which I think is really a cool thing, but also, oh my god, that sounds horrible to execute on Magic Online. Yeah. So I just thought you should know about that one. That one is kind of a new and powerful effect. This is probably not going to see a ton of play, but a new and powerful effect for Mishra's Workshop decks is a 5-mana artifact that makes 2 mana for artifact spells. Actually makes 2 mana for artifact abilities too, because it just says this mana can't be spent on non-artifact spells. And it also has ETB, kill a creature, basically, -5/-5. Dismember is going to kill most creatures, and draw 2 cards. Now, there are definitely some decks I can already think about that would want this effect. The biggest one being the Jewel Shops combo deck. You know, that deck is really interested in being able to kill Hullbreacher and Collector Oof, and this card does that, while also acting as, you know, a semi-combo piece where you can draw cards with this and copy it with Phyrexian Metamorph. It is a legendary artifact, so you will have to sack something if you do like a Metamorph copy. But it also helps pay for the Metamorph copy too, so I think the biggest home for this kind of card looks like to be, you know, Jewel Shops, Jewel PO. But I could see like even normal shops, you know, maybe plays it in their Inventor's Fair board. I could see, you know, KCI, which I guess KCI is not real deck in vintage, but it's a good enough deck in my pet deck, so I'll always talk about KCI when I can. KCI might try this as well. This is a card that's probably not going to see play in vintage, but you should know it exists. This is a different change on Prophetic Prism. Prophetic Prism reads tap 1 in it to change a colorless mana to any mana of any color. This lets you change any amount of colorless mana into mana, or not any amount, you need 2, but if you had infinite colorless mana, this lets you have infinite mana of any color, which I actually think is kind of a unique effect, or at least hasn't been printed on very good cards. So there are definitely possibilities of combo decks that want to play this card. I'm trying to remember. I had this come up building a combo deck where I really needed to cycle colorless mana into other color mana. But I can't remember what it was. But you should know that this card exists, and if you are someone who is building decks that need to change colorless mana to mana, this card is actually, pretty good rate. This is a card I don't think we'll see any vintage play. It's more of a commander card, but it's a really cool card, so I wanted to point it out. This scout over here lets you remove counters from permanents and search for planes. The big thing here would be Urza's Saga. You can just, every time your Urza's Saga search trigger is on the stack, you can remove a counter. I think that will let you make constructs forever and search an artifact every turn, and you're searching for planes. That's a cool little combo. Usually, you don't need to do that. You can do that kind of thing with Thespian Stage as well. But I just don't think that's ever really going to be necessary. I just think it's a cool card, and I wanted to point it out. And last but not least, in new cards, we've got the Haywire Mite. This is a searchable card off of Urza's Saga that can kill non-creature artifacts and non-creature enchantments. Notably, Exile. Exile is an interesting clause because that means it could kill Cauldron Complete. It could kill Bolas's Citadel. It could kill not Blightsteel, because Blightsteel is a creature, not constructs. I don't know. I'm not sure that there are decks that are looking to have a green mana tutorable, Saga tutable exile creature. And obviously it plays pretty bad into Collector Oof and that kind of thing, but definitely a new option for a variety of decks with a nice, interesting effect on a little one-drop creature that you can tutor for. That basically covers all of the new cards. I did want to quickly go into some of the cards that are going to see nice old border treatment, or old frame treatment, I guess I should say. I'm going to run through some of the ones that I like. All right, the best part, old border treatment. You're going to notice a theme, and that would be artifacts. So you're going to get a lot of cards that are for workshop players, but there are definitely a bunch of sideboard cards as well that non-workshop players are going to play. And then we'll just see. Chromatic Lantern, 5-color Golos shops, very nice. Oh, also to note, all of these have a normal printing and a schematic printing. I think the schematic printings are pretty cool. But if you don't like one of the arts, you can maybe use the other one. So, Chromatic Lantern, dope. 5-color shops. Chromatic Star, mostly for my KCI shenanigans, but I'm extremely happy about it. Foundry Inspector, that's a big one. Workshop aggro. Definitely a nice looking schematic. Charbelcher gets a nice old frame. I really like the schematic version too. The other one I'm not as thrilled, but it's got some cool little Black Lotus in the background. A lot of things from like the original art. I think these schematic ones are always from what I've been able to see, like very true and follow some of the original themes, which I think is really cool. KCI, every workshop deck ever. Lodestone Golem getting a nice old frame. It's a big one. Bauble already has an old frame on Magic Online, but I think this is the first paper old frame. Amber, not a vintage card, but maybe someday when we get enough legendary creatures. Mystic Forge, nice. Like I'm saying, all the workshop players are going to get a bunch of their restricted cards old bordered now, old framed. Revoker, old frame Revoker. Man, this is fun. Scrap Trawler, back to KCI. KCI ate real good this set. They're going to get a lot of nice old frame upgrades. Here's one that won't be just workshop players. Everybody, almost anybody can and does play Soul Guide Lanterns. So nice old frame Soul Guide. Springleaf Drum, that's more of a me thing. Sometimes I put one of these in my Saga decks. Probably shouldn't, though. Thorn, more restricted. Man, I wonder how many restricted artifacts got old border treatments this time. Wormcoil Engine. I don't think there is already an old frame Wormcoil Engine, and this schematic version is really nice. Big fan. Also worth noting, the Brothers War had commander decks, and those commander decks are entirely with the old frame. And so we got a bunch of cool Artificer cards in old frame. So new fan favorite Bronze Guardian. This pops up every so often in workshop decks. This doesn't pop up anywhere, but I love the card Teshar, so I put it in this in this walkthrough. Emery. You actually 8-cast decks are going to have a bunch of nice ones. We got Emery, Preordain. I think Preordain had an old frame already, but more printings of it is good. Maybe that's not true. I think that's true. Sai. It doesn't see much play in Vintage anymore, though I've tried it many times. You have 8 casts worth of old frame with Thought Monitor and Thought Cast. I'm pretty excited about those. I like playing Thought Monitor, and I would like it to look pretty. Expressive Iteration with the old multicolor one. Chief of the Foundry. Not always played in aggro shops anymore, but a card that comes in and out of aggro shops. Nihil Spellbomb. I don't think you see as much Nihil Spellbomb because Soul Guide Lantern's a little bit easier to get value from. But you definitely still see people like Renee play this from time to time. Relic of Progenitus. Everyone can play Relic. So a bunch of the nice the sideboard artifacts are all getting nice frames. And Spine of Isha. So more KCI wins. And that's it. I mean, I say that's it. This was like more than a half an hour worth of card discussion. I hope that you were able to find something that interests you. If you didn't see a card and you thought I should have talked about a card, feel free to ask in the comments below. Of course, also tell me your favorite of the old frame. I keep saying old border. It's not really the border, right? It's the frame. Old frame artworks that got reprinted. The one that we really need that we didn't get, Mox Opal. I really could use a old frame Mox Opal for my online PO deck. That when my Moxes don't match, I feel sad, you know. Also Sensei's Top. Sensei's Top would be a good one. Anyways, this went on far too long, but actually that's a pretty good testament to the amount of cool things that are happening in the Brothers War. I'm super excited to play with Hurkyl first and foremost. I think Hurkyl is the most interesting card to me, and I just hope it's good because I want to play it. New Vintage videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, especially next Friday, where I'm going to be releasing my 250th Vintage League on Magic Online, and I have a special deck cooked up. I'll see you then.